Hello. I was wondering about starting to speak as I walked up, but that was a bit cheesy. Hello, everyone. It's fantastic. I hope you're enjoying everything. We've certainly got a huge crowd here, which is wonderful. And I think hopefully at the back, the volume's not too bad. I think yesterday it was a bit lower, but we've cranked it up. So apologies to the people who have been deafened by the increase in volume. We are moving on to a panel just now, so I'm really thrilled to be here to help chair this panel. We did have Professor David Low, but unfortunately he wasn't able to attend, so I'm having to try and step in, and it will be impossible for me to cover his great excellence in that one, but I'll do my best. And we're going to talk about success. Particularly, what does success look like if you are taking from the supplier side, if you are developing a product or a service that uses AI in healthcare. If you succeed, this is great. We want to try and learn some lessons from this. You know, what factors in what you built, how you developed, tested it, contributes to that success? How about your relationships with the end users, the doctors and the patients, and also the suppliers? Now, the people procuring this as well, these are important things to understand. So there'll be factors that led to their success. There'll have been challenges along the way, and you've heard in some of the earlier talks today what these might be. But we're going to dive a little deeper into this right now with two wonderful panelists. So over on the far side, we have Dr. Joshua Luck, who is an AI and Digital Health Fellow from Skin Analytics. I'm going to get him to introduce himself in a second. And then we have Peter Kirpalani-Collins, who's the Chief Clinical Officer at HN. So we're going to get them to introduce themselves in a second as I move across. We're going to talk for a little bit, but we're also going to save a little bit of time towards the end if anyone has any questions. I don't know if there's a microphone out there. If there's not, I'll come out and bring the microphone to you. But with that, I'm going to assume my position. Oh, and also mention there is a survey that you're being asked to complete. Please do complete this to help the students who are working on this area and the resident doctors. Okay, so let's kick off. All right, maybe I'll go to you, Peter, first of all. Do you want to just say a little bit more about yourself and HN?
Yeah, hi everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Peter. I'm a nurse by background, been in healthcare for over 20 years. Started off in pediatric oncology in my career, both in NHS and private, and then I moved to the world of digital health about 5 or 6 years ago and then found a new passion. So I am the Chief Clinical Officer at HN. We are a company that does a couple of different things, but we are driven to have how we can see AI and machine learning on data sets within healthcare and then try and work that out, how we can find proactive and predictive mechanisms within that. So we have a AI tool that goes into our healthcare database and tries to predict who is going to be a high intensity user within the next 6 to 12 months before they become a high intensity user. And then we will then deliver a targeted clinical coaching program to understand what their problems are and then to try and stop them becoming a high-intensity user. That's our main goals.
Fantastic. And look, as I'm sure you can appreciate, it's very, very useful to understand ahead of schedule who might become unwell and help make them take steps. This is the move towards prevention, which is fantastic. Well, how about yourself, Josh?
Hi there. Thank you, Keith. My name's Josh. I'm an ST5 plastic surgery registrar by background and the AI and Digital Health Fellow at Skin Analytics. My role there really focuses upon medical affairs, so supporting our clinical research and regulatory teams, but also with wider roles supporting our NHS partner-facing teams, so commercial and transformation teams, to help bring the benefits of our technology to more patients across the NHS. Skin Analytics is a health technology company and an AI as a medical device manufacturer, and we use our regulated AI as a medical device DERM to help meet the growing gap between dermatology, supply and demand across the NHS. So Gordon has illustrated some of those challenges that are faced by dermatology services, 1 in 4 consultant posts unfilled, skin cancer referrals increasing by 10% year on year. And we're now deployed with over 20 NHS organisations really to achieve 3 key things. Firstly, to speed up faster diagnosis for patients with cancer. Secondly, to more quickly reassure those patients with benign non-cancerous lesions. And then finally, to allow clinician and dermatologist capacity in particular to be returned to seeing and treating patients with skin cancer and other non-cancer conditions.
And fantastic again, you know, I think we're hearing from Gordon earlier on and some of the speakers today about the importance in this area. And as a former GP, I spent a large amount of my time dealing with skin complaints and having to interface with that area. So yeah, I can see it being a big problem. So you're both working with companies that have achieved success in terms of deployment of this, particularly with the use of artificial intelligence in its broadest sense. People in the audience are maybe going to wonder, how is it you've managed that? You're maybe further ahead with this, or you've achieved some things that they would like to emulate. So in terms of the work you've done, maybe going to you, Josh, first of all, what were the factors that led to the success there?
So I think going back to Skin Analytics' inception 12 years ago, there's been a strong desire to try and do the right thing, even though that is often very challenging, time-consuming and difficult. So for example, going back to the initial development of the product, it took 7 years to design, test, train and validate the technology in a series of prospective powered clinical trials before we were first deployed as the first AI technology in the NHS for dermatology back in 2020. That's a recognition that building clinical AI is not an overnight project, but really a years or decades long process. So along the way, we're very proud to be the only UKCA Class 2A AI as a medical device in dermatology. What does that mean? It means that globally we are the only technology in dermatology that is licensed for autonomous use. And I think that meeting those regulatory hurdles and milestones head on has been one of the ways in which we've been able to build trust in our product and also build traction in the NHS.
So it's really important. I mean, I think we all realize that if we want to use these technologies, that there needs to be evidence that it's safe and effective. And the proof of this is in its safety, its regulatory compliance. From your perspective, are these things chiming with you as well in the work that's done at HM?
No, 100%. And we've taken the same approach. It's all about the evidence base. And we have done a 5-year RCT before we launched, and it followed up with further real-world evidence. And that's a continuous development that never stops. And I think the other important thing we got in early was we're a health tech company, and it's a balance between health and tech. And so we concentrated on building the right team, so it's just not people we don't get loads of AI engineers that just mine the data. We have clinicians that work closely with the AI team to understand what they're doing with the data, how they're using it, and what the outputs are to make sure it is equitable.
So it's about having that clinical context as well. Is it the same with Skin Analytics as well? Did they have that early integration of the kind of clinical health side of things with the product?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a 12-person clinical team at Skin Analytics with in-house biostatistics support and the other sort of research components of that. So these kind of cross-functional clinical teams. And I think where that really helps us now is in recognizing that we are, I suppose, leading the market for AI as a medical device technologies in dermatology, and being able to build and deliver a really robust post-market surveillance strategy that allows us to provide real-world performance data, like Gordon has alluded to, that we're very honest and transparent about publishing, for example, on our website. And I think that by having clinicians and allied healthcare professionals at the heart of that, you're able to take clinicians and healthcare service providers on that journey with you.
I think, yeah, I mean, as a doctor working in health tech, I'm really delighted to hear this, and actually working in my role in my company and helping work with lots of different companies as well. That's not always the case. There's quite often, a lack of that kind of input in there as well. But you've had this in from the start. With maybe sort of like talking about what it took to achieve that success and those factors, were there any sort of barriers that came up to having that implementation from earlier on, or was there a very open door in both companies that you're aware of?
I think there are barriers, and in this and a previous company I worked in, trying to get that balance between clinical and tech is quite hard. A lot of the founders, and this isn't a criticism to any founders, but they are generally technologists by background, is how I've understood it. So that's what they know and how they tackle it, and when they're setting up a company, that's their focus. And to come in and trying to get that balance has been a challenge. And most clinicians, as you walk in, aren't technology driven. We do not. When I first walked in, I had no idea what Jira was, for instance. And you're like, well, what are these words people are saying? So we both have to learn from each other. And that was, I think, the biggest challenge of the company, is to try and get both sides to understand each other.
It's such an important role for everyone in the company to sort of understand. And I think where I've seen clinicians successfully deployed is there's an element of, first of all, kind of humility, but also the ability to be able to translate those things that they really understand. I mean, we've got quite a lot of maybe clinicians who are interested in working in health tech here as well and trying to find their way in. Is there anything that you think that they could do to make that journey for them easier in that? I mean, you've had an open door maybe in both of these sectors, but what are the sort of characteristics of the clinicians working in your organizations that have made them effective in that? To either of you.
I suppose I can take that question. We have clinicians involved in our company in very different ways. We have a clinical advisory committee who oversee the kind of performance targets that we set. So Gordon spoke to for example, wealth of systematic review and meta-analysis data benchmarking. Well, how good are consultant dermatologists at correctly identifying skin cancer? Perhaps somewhere between 84 and 94%. So all of our performance targets are set to exceed that, and we're able to report on for example, real-world performance, tens of thousands of cases, many thousands of cancers found, showing that our sensitivity is 98% for that. We have clinical clinicians embedded within the company, like myself, but we also, I think, have reached the stage of our deployment and maturity in the NHS that actually we have a number of clinical champions out there speaking on behalf of us at conferences like the British Association of Dermatologists. So what does that mean? It means that having been deployed for 4.5 years in the NHS, seen over 135,000 patients and found nearly 10,000 cancers, we're now at the tipping point of seeing maybe 15% of all skin cancer referrals in the UK. And we now have that experience for clinicians who have used our technology, who are users of our service, to go out and say, well, what did we do well? What worked well for us? What didn't work so well for us? And how can we continue to improve those kind of AI-enabled care pathways?
I mean, this is great. You're also speaking to the importance of engaging with the end users as well and getting proper stakeholder involvement along the way, maybe in slightly different forms. So that's great. But maybe for either of you to talk about here about the involvement of the patients and patient groups in this as well. It's very, very important to have their voice in at all times and to do this meaningfully as well. So maybe any lessons that you learned from either of your companies about how they were involved?
Yeah, so before we deploy into any NHS institution, whether it's a trust, an ICB, or even just a local GP or a hospital, we always set up PPIE workshops before we go in to really understand, because we do clinical coaching in the end after our model to understand what the problems are with the patients. A lot of those are dependent on the region they're in, so we will always set up patient PPIE workshops beforehand. And a lot of the concerns that patients have that will keep coming up in those workshops is data. And they just want to know how they're going to use the data. How does your actual algorithm work? It's like this special black box that no one really understands, like the algorithm. So they just want to, we do those really to build up trust and reassurance, because AI is still this unknown thing out there, and it has a lot of mistrust. And so we try and use those workshops to try and alleviate those barriers, answer lots of questions as much as we can.
And I can probably build upon that. Skin, again, from the start, we had that PPIE baked into the heart of what we do. So we were the first company to run a powered prospective study of patient perceptions of AI in skin cancer pathway, published in a peer-review journal, demonstrating that the majority of patients would rather have their skin assessed by an AI technology than wait weeks or months to see a dermatologist. And then you have to take that kind of research evidence and take it into the real-world setting. So we work with a patient charity called Melano More, who provide that kind of patient voice on all of our, for example, patient-facing materials, helping to co-design pathways. And then I think, more importantly, again, we're at the stage now of talking really around real-world data. So in all of our deployments, we have patient feedback, net promoter scores, friends and family tests that are there. So we're able to say, look, this is how patients perceive us in the real world. This is what they want to know about our technology and our pathway. And yes, do they support using AI in this way for their clinical care?
So this all sounds great. These are sort of contributing to the success of that kind of product build and the evidence down the line. But you also have to balance this against the fact that it's taking a long time. It's costing money and resource and everything like that. So do you know how these arguments were made, or this sort of discussions were made in the business itself? The business has to proceed at a certain rate. It only has a certain amount of resource to do that. So, how do you make that argument within the wider company that they should be committing to this area when they've maybe got 1,000 things balanced around? how would you maybe make that argument? It may have predated your involvement with the company, but understanding what you do now, how would you make that how would you stand on one side and say, we have to spend more time on this, we have to commit to this thing because?
I mean, it's a nice thing. It's all about culture within the company. And I think that's a very important thing to get right. Everyone that's in AI as a medical device is there for the right reason, to see how it benefits the patient. And it's trying to understand that culture comes from top down. And we're very lucky that who our CEO is, and everything within the company believes that to their core. And we've been very lucky to have that at HN, and I think it just transparent. So it's not even an argument. It's there embedded from day one that how does this benefit the patient, and you only get that through those feedback mechanisms and making sure the day you're building the AI tools that you're thinking about the patient from day one, so the risks are built in. It follows through with everything you do, and so I think it just has to come from day one.
Would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, if you take health tech or just focus on tech companies, really those guys know about product and user, and ultimately the user, even if they're not the payer in the NHS, is a patient. That's who benefits, that's where the clinical benefit sits. And so I think keeping patients aligned to the mission of the company is really important. And I think that what we've learned in our experience to date is that we learn so much from talking to patients. We learn that from talking to, for example, our focus groups. We have a clinician on our team who's our dedicated PPI lead. But also we've learned that through a series of sort of grant-funded independent evaluations where, as part of that, patient feedback is critical. It's not just your clinical value, it's not just your health economic value, but it's also what patient feedback are you getting. So, for example, as winners of the AI in Health and Care Award and recent SBRI National Cancer Programme grants, part of that, and a key part of that sort of success exit point is, well, what do patients think about your technology and how is it benefiting patients?
This is great. So this has got your product, your service, you're building the right thing, you've got the evidence, you're showing that it's effective, but of course, none of this really matters until it's actually deployed in the real world. So this is moving towards that kind of procurement and end user side of things. And again, you've had successes in this area. So maybe we'll sort of start and say, as you started building towards that, what were the things that helped? What were the factors in how you approached this that led to a warmer reception, like the things that made it move a little bit more easily for you when it came to working with the NHS to start bringing your product on board?
So I think, perhaps it's a controversial opinion, but I think the NHS is fantastic at fostering innovation. I've spoken about some of those national grant programs that we've been awarded, and I think what that really helps is funding those first pilot deployments to build that real-world evidence of clinical and health economic value. And without that, you really can't proceed. I think where the NHS then sometimes struggles is, how do you take technologies that have proven clinical and health economic value and scale that much more widely? So how do you get from that pilot to business as usual? And I think that often the constraint there in a financially constrained system is really funding. And I think there's a role for central organisations, NHS England in particular, to support technologies to move from pilot to widespread business as usual funding with ring-fenced pots of money. And I think that can often be very well tied to procurement frameworks. We're on a number of procurement frameworks, but none of those, they're all square pegs, round holes. We've heard rumours and been invited to contribute to an AI as a medical device specific procurement framework, which would be a fantastic development. And I think that in that, there may be an opportunity to solve some of those other pain points that are felt by both NHS and supplier side around some of those repetitive governance processes, those data sharing agreements, data security, DPIA, information governance, that is such a tedious deployment operational challenge, but often a hurdle that it's hard to overcome. So really a joined up central funding, ring-fenced budget with some procurement and alignment of those sort of governance processes.
Yeah, it's that governance process bit that I hear an awful lot from the people that I work with and experience myself as well. It seems to be an interesting piece of friction because everyone's kind of aligned on wanting to get good things out there and so on, but there's so much variation in how one piece of documentation, one framework might be written or interpreted that, at least I can say from the supplier side, it feels like you might work very hard to go to one area, but it might not shift to another. You have to start again and again and again. To what extent do you think the suppliers can What work can the suppliers do to sort of help with that? Because you could maybe sit back and say, well, I just would like the NHS to solve this for me, thank you very much, but there's so many things going on. So is there anything that could be done on the supplier side to help deal with that?
No, I think the first thing is to remember it's not a supplier-vendor relationship. You're not just offering them a product and then stepping back. It's a collaboration. I think that's the key. And you have to go in with that mindset. The data protection hurdles are massive. And rightly so, because that's the number one thing that we hear in our PPIE is people are worried about their data. They see the benefit, yes, and all those things you said about people would prefer the AI are true. But they are still worried about this whole concern about data. And so the data provider CSUs are difficult. We've just about to deploy in North East London, and there are 260 GPs that we're trying to get across, and the one ICB. We have to get 260 different data protection officers to sign off, and everyone has a slightly different opinion. It's hard work, and they're not all joined up, and you'll do a DPIA form that's brilliant for one, and another one will find fault with it. And so I think there needs to be a way to solve that framework and to make more consistency across the process.
Yeah, so what do you think needs to be done to solve that? I mean, I'm not asking you to solve this, but what do you think would be one way to approach this? Any thoughts on that, or is it just so complex that it's beyond the ken of one man or woman to do this?
Yeah, I wish it was easy. I think there's a problem, isn't it? Because everyone understands why DTAC and DPIA is important, and if you lose that, you're going to lose some of the trust that gets built up. So it's a safety net to ensure the suppliers, to ensure the hospitals, to ensure the patients that there is a level of security and trust there. The biggest problem is that flexibility with an understanding what the framework should be. And even like when you're doing your clinical safety reports, your DCB 0129, you'll pass it over and everyone will have a different opinion on whether you've done the risk correctly or not. And they're all very important things, but I don't know if there's enough consistency yet. And the other things is like, can the ICBs offer more consistency in how they do data protection across that whole thing? North East London offer one DPO to the GPs for free, so there is a consistency on that, but not everyone chooses to take that up. So you will have a slightly different problem across the same ICB. So I don't know if for NHS England or that there's more frameworks that can be put in place just to make sure there's a more consistent level of input.
Consistency of a standard, consistency of application, I suppose helps that you can build towards this as well. And I'm certainly seeing that being proposed in many places, that sort of ICB level. If we speak about the clinical safety side of things, solving at a higher level that can then be more easily translated down towards the ends of this sort of tree, this network, because the frontline staff who may be deploying this, if you're talking about primary care, may have less of an understanding of clinical safety, regulation, data protection, cybersecurity, but are no less concerned about the importance of that too. So yeah, it has to be simplified, I think.
Yes, I think there's also, again, to go back to the start, is you've got to hire the right people on your team that are going to really set that standard and raise the bar. So we're very lucky to have, for example, a couple of clinical safety officers who are fantastic, and what they share around our, for example, clinical safety framework is then often taken by our partner sites that we work with and then shared onwards with future prospective partner sites. So there's almost this tipping point that we're reaching as a company where, again, the NHS network can provide that benefit, and for that sort of shared learning and shared understanding of how do you overcome some of these hurdles and what have people done to solve for these problems before and what can we learn from that.
That's a really, really important point. I strongly believe this too. It's about openness. We are all working on a difficult problem, and actually, most often aligned to do good as well. But by sharing best practice at events like this, but also in the work that's done, really helps, particularly when you're working with novel technologies such as artificial intelligence that move very, very fast. It's difficult for someone from the outside to say, oh no, I've worked this out. This is how you do it. So no, big believer in that. So yes, please, everyone here, contribute towards that sense of openness and sharing, understanding and learning. It will help us move forward. So these are sort of great factors about the sort of success, particularly the sort of collaboration and the partnership, but we also want to sort of look at the things that made it harder, maybe unnecessarily harder, any kind of like blocks along the way in the experience. So would either of you like to sort of say some of the things that have happened along the way that you think made this unnecessarily hard or difficult, or challenges that either were resolved but but have yet to be resolved? The sort of the difficulties of getting this.
I think the challenge that we came across is the data quality changes across everywhere we go. And our AI tools really work on high quality data. And you're moving to one ICB or one ICS or just a different hospital, and the way they code data is slightly different, and just the quality they feed back and that will impact the model that we work on. So I think data quality needs to be, that is a challenge. How we can make that more consistent and how people use it and how people code patients across the system would really help us. Data protection is always going to be a problem, and it probably was our biggest hurdle, and we underestimated the time. Even though we put a lot of lead time in, we underestimated that. So I think that would be a lesson I'd like to give to people is like, do not underestimate how long it takes to deploy in the NHS. And you build it into your model and you promise that you'll be live, say, in 3 months, and it probably just won't happen. And so you just need to do that. And then that will allow you to be open and build up that trust and realistic timelines rather than being on the back foot from day one.
So I think that the lesson that we learned back in 2020 was taking a technology and deploying it in the real world. You get a drop in performance and you have to very quickly work to solve that. It's very easy now in some ways to download an off-the-shelf convolutional network, train it on some synthetic data on the internet, and then show that it might perform. But actually, when you get out there and you're with real-world variables, which in our case is real-world pictures taken by real-world people on real-world patients, actually, can you really maintain that? And I think that there we're able to point to this enormous wealth of real-world evidence and performance data to continue to demonstrate that the system is performing safely. And then more than that, well, how does that performance translate into meaningful clinical benefits for patients? You know, is that patients getting faster diagnosis? Is that being able to safely discharge patients with non-cancerous lesions? And the two are not necessarily equivalent. And I think there what we've been on is a journey of learning, well, what are the evidence modalities that we need to take to translate our post-market clinical follow-up activities into tangible benefits for health system commissioners, for example, to understand, for clinicians to understand, and for patients to understand. How does using this technology benefit me, benefit the system?
And how have you found the clinician end users in accepting these technologies as well? I mean, it could be an interesting area. I think, speaking as a clinician in the practice, I was very, very acutely aware of the problems that I faced in my day-to-day work, but equally sometimes found it very, very difficult to think beyond how I worked, you know, to change practice. What's the sort of general sense about the end users, maybe in this case the clinicians accepting these changes? Have they been very receptive, or have there been any particular aspects of their reception that have been problems?
So I think that you'll always have early clinical adopters, you'll always have people that are laggards on that scale. Really, clinicians at the heart, and I speak as a clinician here, are always skeptical, and I think rightly so. They want to know that this technology is proven to be safe and effective, but I think what's really unique about AI technologies is that they confront ourselves with well, what is standard of care? Well, how good am I, as Josh sat in a skin cancer clinic, at correctly identifying skin cancer? And often that mirror effect is quite confronting. You know, I don't know how many skin cancers I miss, I don't follow it up. There are no governance processes in place for me to monitor my own activities, but we set, and I think rightfully so, incredibly high standards for AIs and medical device technologies, and we have to have that post-market surveillance clinical governance to say, yes, it is actually, you know, it's not missing cancers, it is safely discharging patients, and those patients are not coming to harm by deploying a technology that would be unsafe. I think that increasingly people are becoming aware of the kind of system challenges that impact your performance as a clinician. I think that what we're often very good as clinicians at doing is maybe seeing the 18 patients on our clinic list in front of us, but not the 18,000 waiting to see us. And I think something that's true in dermatology as other specialties is, you know, waiting lists are not places of safety for patients. Waiting lists are places of harm and risk for patients. And what I'm seeing and really encouraged by is a closer collaboration between decision-maker clinicians and operational NHS England folk and kind of ICS level folk and trust level folk to say, we have a shared understanding of this problem space and we need to do something about it because patients are coming to harm even if we're not seeing it.
There was the strong agreement on all that, and I think HEE brought out a report a couple of years ago now, talked about the importance, this was from an educational and trust perspective, of 5 archetypes: shapers, drivers, builders, implementers, I think it was, and then end users too. And you're right, for any sort of successful deployment, you have to win over and co-produce in that situation as well. And I'm also very sort of taken by what you said about the mirror. I use that line an awful lot, is that the resistance that I see to any change, but particularly with artificial intelligence, is that it forces us to lift up a rock and kind of look underneath it, or like look at ourselves, sometimes in quite a lot of detail. How biased are we? What is our current performance? What happens to the patients that leave us? If we only see the ones that come back to us, we're missing all the rest of it. I think finding a way to start measuring that, to understand what the true baseline is, would maybe allow us to feel a bit more comfortable about bringing a technology that we hold to be perfect, but was maybe slightly less than perfect. Do you think that's maybe true?
I completely agree. And I think it's how you build trust is that openness and transparency between everyone, right? And so how they understand our product works, I think that's a lot of the nervousness we've had with clinicians. Like, how can you predict certain things are going to happen? How do you know it's going to work? I come back to that whole black box, is that they just don't understand what's in the box and how it predicts what it does, and how can you be better than a human. There's still that nervousness around it that we have to untangle, and how we get around those biases are quite difficult.
Yeah. Well, actually, it might be useful just for a moment to sort of talk a bit about explainability, because we've heard it mentioned a few times here today as well. You want to sort of maybe in a sort of simple term, or explain what explainability means with your model, if that's okay. And if there's a similar feature for skin analytics, that'd be great. But just for the audience here, for those that maybe don't understand so much, when you talk about explainability, what do you mean?
How to explain explainability is kind of
E squared.
So for us, it's like it's trying to get a user, a clinician, to understand the problem we're trying to solve. So an AI tool is like this, I keep saying black box, but this box that goes in, you feed data in and out it comes, it will predict which patients we think are going to be a high intensity user in the 6 months. We then try and have to demonstrate to clinicians and our services like how that works, what inputs that we take, how do we output without it being ticking up biases, how we're not increasing health inequalities, how we're not taking already biased data and output in into a biased system. And so for us, explainability is literally trying to prove how our model works, going back on our real-world evidence and our RCTs to explain this is what we've done, this is how we've measured against all the concerns that someone would have in a system, and openness and transparency. I think that's the biggest thing of explainability, is an openness and transparency of your system, not hiding onto this IP that everyone touts. I can't explain it, it's going to affect my intellectual property. It's like trying to be as open and as honest as you possibly can to a client, to reassure them and to the patient in the end.
Now, it's interesting you say about IP. Of course, there was a talk earlier on today, and there's some recordings going to be available afterwards for those that missed that, to go into it. Just maybe got a couple of minutes before I maybe open it up to some questions. So if you have any questions for the panel, start thinking about them. But we've talked about a lot of different areas, about the things that worked, about the things with some challenges. Maybe asking both of you to think about a call to action. We've got an audience here. Like, what sort of things could the people here do and take away to help improve this kind of flow? What would be your call to action to the people here?
I think for me it would be to recognise and challenge the status quo bias that exists in current ways of working in current health systems. We know that there is harm in the system, and that harm will continue to happen unless we do something different. But that status quo bias doesn't come because people are not well intentioned. It comes because there's a blind spot about, what is the scale of this harm and how do we quantify that? So I can perhaps illustrate something from the dermatology space that we speak to. We know dermatology is the largest cancer referring specialty, and with the workforce constraints, dermatology departments are spending through the nose to try and meet those kind of urgent suspected cancer referrals with which they're completely overwhelmed. But by doing so, they're often cancelling routine and clinic appointments. So what we've seen is this sort of paradoxical, we've got to cope with this cancer demand, but let's ignore these patients with debilitating inflammatory skin conditions, eczema, psoriasis, waiting 6, 12 months for their first assessment. But what's really interesting is that actually, perversely, 1 in 3 high-risk skin cancers, melanoma, SCC, are found in those routine referrals. So you're leaving patients for 6, 9, 12 months with a melanoma that should have been diagnosed and treated within 28 days. Our modelling would say there's about 2,000 melanoma waiting in the 450,000 patients who are currently waiting to be seen just in England, and a similar number of SCC. And how do you quantify the harm associated with that? That's patient morbidity and patient mortality in the existing system. And what are the kind of health economic costs, direct and indirect? And we're working with an academic health research group on that. So the status quo has harm, and my call to action would be for clinicians and operational folk to really work together to say, we need to understand this problem space and we need to do something different because current ways of working are not working for patients.
Absolutely. How about yourself?
I can't really follow that, but I agree with everything you said. I think for me, it's innovation alone is not enough. And so it's not just about delivering a product and stepping back, it's really going in with a collaborative mindset. And that's from both the NHS and the supplier. And then for everyone in the room, when you are being the supplier, to understand that we have to evidence what we do. And that has to be consistent across the board. And that will build up trust within AI for everyone. And so if we're all doing the same thing, there'll be no one will worry about it. There are no charlatans out there that we're all trying to meet and work to the same standards. AI as a medical device is a relatively new term and a new thing, but I think that will help drive things forward. The regulations are changing. It's very difficult for us all to keep up with those and what that means, but we have to try and keep on track of those, and we can all try and be ahead of the game.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. So let's maybe go to the audience. So we've got just under 10 minutes for questions, and I don't know if there's a microphone. If not, I'm going to come out with this microphone. I'll come on out. I'll stretch my legs. Okay, I will come to the front first of all. Do you just want to introduce yourself and then maybe ask the question?
Hi. Okay. Hi, my name is Levan. I work at the Alan Turing Institute in the Health Grand Challenge area. I'm a research data scientist there. You talked a lot about barriers translating from pilot studies to real world, and one of them was setting up data protection agreements and government processes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have any examples of this being solved in other domains in UK, or do you have examples of this being solved in other countries in the health domain, for example, in the US or other esoteric like pop-up cities? I don't know if you've heard of Vitalia, where like people are starting from zero, like with no regulations, and you can do anything, and they're trying to see if that accelerates adoption of health technologies. Thank you.
In a word, no. It is painful whenever you go from that sort of, you've built this model and then you're trying to look for your first deployment. I think that we should be careful about places that don't have any of those regulatory hurdles. Those are in place to really protect patients at the end of the day from technologies that could be dangerous and harmful from entering the market. And I think that Peter spoke about the kind of emerging pace of that regulatory understanding developing, and I think that we should welcome those standards being lifted. We don't want to have devices on the market that would erode trust in existing devices, but also erode trust in patients using these technologies. On the specific point about those kind of the sort of operational hurdles, governance, data security, data sharing, in the UK it's still a totally fragmented ecosystem. I think there is a space for companies, and I know of some that are out there trying to build these kind of platform-based approaches to say, you can demonstrate conformity against set standards and then go around and be able to show that to potential purchasers. But again, it's still very much an emerging market in its infancy.
But I suppose actually just to answer your question as well, there will be some benefits to taking a lighter weight approach or a novel approach or a sort of no legacy approach to this as well too. I mean, you're talking about spaces where there's previously been no regulation. I don't think anyone's arguing potentially that it should continue to be no regulation, but there is an opportunity to sort of ditch any sort of legacy aspects of regulation, or maybe start regulation in a much more sort of holistic or compliant way. So I think there is some possibilities in there. I get twitchy as well. The idea of like no need for regulation at all makes me a wee bit worried. But there is an opportunity because there are aspects of all the different compliance standards that potentially unnecessarily do get in the way or complexify things. And we've already said, what's the current standard of practice? It's not as if it's all perfect right now.
No, and I was going to agree with that, and I'm sure, I know Hugh's talking later, so he'll touch on this better than I can, but AI as a medical device is a new thing. Software as a medical device was before that, so AI as a medical device is merged into that. But most of the notified bodies and regulators based all their assumptions on a medical device rather than software as a medical device and AI as a medical device? Is it designed enough for the needs that we want? And it is a moving regulation, and it's moving with a pace. And it's just quite difficult as a supplier to try and keep up with those regulations and to try and be ahead of the scenes, because they will change almost daily at the moment.
If you're interested in regulation, of course, at 2:30, there's going to be some coverage of this in The Trouble with AI in a panel back through here. Anyway, another question.
Hello. I would like to touch ground on the explainability. Yeah, you mentioned that, well, you have some training set, and then there is a neural network that you feed the training set that is based on some predefined parameters, probably tagged images, yeah? Okay, not okay. Let's imagine next year there will be a new iPhone with a new camera. Probably there will be a new camera. And how do we apply these technological advances of the hardware, and how do we connect and bridge the gap, on increasing the gap? So we have a training set that is coming from iPhone 13. Now we have, I don't know, iPhone 18 or something. How do we connect those two? Because they are probably very different on a meta level.
Yeah, so a challenge at Skin Analytics that we have solved for in the past, we have a hardware device qualification process. So all new hardware that could be compatible with our technology goes through a process to say, actually, these images are still suitable to be assessed by that. And we have an approved list of hardware combinations. For us, that's a series of different smartphone devices with different dermatoscope attachments. But you're absolutely right. You need to monitor that your device is being used safely and as per its intended use in its intended population. And for us, with the hardware component to that, we also need to monitor for that, and we have specific audits making sure that that only approved hardware is out there on the market for us being used.
That's great. Is there another question? That's great. We may got space for one, maybe two more questions. So I'll come to you and then to you.
Hi, my name's Dan. I'm a doctor in London and a founder of an AI tech company. This conversation has raised, for me, a really interesting point between throughput and the accuracy of AI tools. We could imagine a scenario where an AI tool has far higher throughput, and you mentioned the wait lists are a place not of safety for our patients. What's the state of the conversation between that tension between throughput and accuracy? Must we insist that all the AI tech which gets to market is both higher throughput and human or above accuracy for the consultant level? Or is there room for some technologies which maybe if they fall just short of the accuracy which we would set the standard to, because of the throughput, there could be applications for those types of technologies? Thank you.
It's a great question, and then I don't think there is a right answer to that one. I think we should always aim to be above a human accuracy, always. I think that should be our base level, and that will, so how does it actually impact the system? How does it actually impact the patient? And that's where you come back to your RCTs and your continual real-world evidence. What difference is it making? Are we seeing a reduction in, for us, urgent care emissions, reducing A&E emissions? Are we going above what is the status quo? If it's not going above the status quo, then what is the point? Or why are you introducing this technology that could potentially add harm? Because every time you introduce a new thing, it can potentially add harm. Why are you adding it if it's not going to add any benefit? Unless you can prove that there's a system benefit and that overall, you could try and do the health economics on it. But I think we have to understand where we want the standard to be. And again, it comes down to consistency and understanding the process, but I don't think we're fully there yet.
And I think we're in the foothills of AI as a medical device technology still, and I think that it's a reasonable benchmark to say, well, you know, when you go and see a consultant clinician, how good are they at accurately diagnosing, for example, in our case, skin cancer, but that could be radiologists looking at scans, and benchmarking to that expert performance, I think, is a good place to start. But there is a nuanced conversation that I think will come around those technologies that are maybe below that level. You know, whether there is a wider system benefit to them. But I don't think we have the level of understanding about those system effects yet to be able to move towards that with confidence. And we need to take clinicians, we need to take patients on that journey with us and really have a lot of trust that the technologies that are being used out there at the moment, you know, they're not going to replace clinicians, but they are performing at that level.
So, my name is Fina Mateo. I work for Legit Health. This is also an AI-driven company. Actually, we also have developed a software in dermatology. So my question is for Skin Analytics, because you mentioned that it's CA certified. So I want to know under what regulation. So is it under MDD? Is it MDR? And if so, which class is that medical device?
So we're a UKCA Class 2A as AI as a medical device technology, so the only one on the market, and globally that means we're the only technology approved for autonomous use in dermatology. We're in the very final stages of a CE Class 3 approval with a notified body that will come to fruition over the next maybe 7 or 10 days. So we can speak about that now, that's coming, and that will allow us to bring our technology to new markets in Europe.
Yep. And with that, we're going to wrap up. Can you just join me in thanking our two brilliant panelists, Peter and Josh? So that's great. So you can step down. Our next speaker